The chambers of the Medici palace were shrouded in the amber glow of candlelight when Niccolo Machiavelli first encountered the woman who would forever alter his understanding of power. It was the winter of 1513, and Florence lay under the weight of political upheaval. The great theorist of statecraft, recently released from the dungeons of the Bargello, found himself in the peculiar position of observing not the machinations of princes, but the subtle maneuvers of a different kind of sovereign entirely. Caterina Sforza had arrived at court that evening, her presence commanding attention without utterance of a single word. She moved through the gathered nobility like a predator surveying territory, her eyes calculating distances and measuring weaknesses with the precision of a military engineer. Machiavelli, himself no stranger to the art of observation, found his analytical mind drawn to decipher the mechanics of her influence. Here was a woman who had held fortress cities against papal armies, who had negotiated with kings and condemned men to death with equal composure. Yet her power operated through channels entirely different from those he had codified in his treatises on princely rule. As the evening progressed, Machiavelli witnessed a series of interactions that would form the foundation of his most controversial and least understood observations about the nature of feminine power. A young merchant, flush with recent success in the silk trade, approached Caterina with the swagger of a man accustomed to purchasing what he desired. Within minutes of conversation, she had extracted not only the location of his warehouses and the extent of his debts, but had somehow convinced him that revealing such information had been his own brilliant idea. The transformation was complete, from predator to willing prey, accomplished through methods that made conventional diplomatic coercion seem crude by comparison. The Florentine secretary observed similar scenes repeated throughout the night, each interaction revealing layers of strategy that operated beneath the surface of social convention. Women who appeared to defer to masculine authority were, upon closer examination, orchestrating the very decisions they seemed to accept. They possessed an intuitive understanding of human weakness that surpassed even the most sophisticated political intelligence. Their influence was exercised not through the blunt instruments of force or wealth, but through the manipulation of desire, insecurity, and the fundamental need for validation that drove men to actions they would later struggle to explain even to themselves. It was during these observations that Machiavelli began to formulate what would become his most dangerous insight, that the conventional understanding of power relationships between men and women was not merely incomplete, but deliberately inverted. The apparent dominance of masculine authority masked a deeper reality in which feminine influence operated as the true organizing principle of human behavior. Men might control the visible structures of society, the armies, the treasuries, the formal institutions of governance, but women controlled the invisible forces that determined how those structures would actually function. This realization struck him with the force of a military revelation. In his studies of warfare, he had learned that the most effective strategies often involved allowing the enemy to believe they held the advantage while maneuvering them into positions of weakness. Could it be that womankind had been employing this principle not merely in individual relationships, but as a species-wide strategy for the acquisition and exercise of power? The implications were staggering, and they would require a fundamental reconceptualization of everything he thought he understood about human nature and political control. The months that followed were spent in intensive study not of military campaigns or diplomatic correspondence, but of the daily interactions between men and women in every stratum of Florentine society. Machiavelli haunted marketplaces and attended church services, observed merchant negotiations and aristocratic marriages, always with the eye of a strategist attempting to decode the true mechanics of influence and control. What he discovered challenged not only his previous theories, but the very foundations upon which masculine confidence was built. In the workshops of the artisan quarter, he watched wives manage household economies with a sophistication that would have impressed banking houses, while their husbands remained convinced they were making the important decisions. These women understood not only the flow of resources and the management of debt, but the psychology of expenditure and investment in ways that transformed apparent powerlessness into practical control. They knew which purchases to resist and which to encourage, understanding that the appearance of yielding on minor matters could secure influence over major ones. More fascinating still was their approach to information gathering and dissemination. While men conducted their business through formal networks of alliance and obligation, women had constructed parallel systems of intelligence that penetrated every level of society. Servants, merchants' wives, courtesans, and noble ladies formed an interconnected web of communication that could spread news, shape opinions, and coordinate action with remarkable efficiency. They possessed what amounted to a shadow government that operated entirely outside official recognition, yet influenced every significant decision made within the visible power structure. The sexual dimension of these dynamics proved most revealing of all. Machiavelli had always understood that desire could be weaponized, but he had conceived of this primarily in terms of masculine conquest. Observation revealed the opposite, that feminine sexuality operated as perhaps the most sophisticated form of political control ever devised. Women did not merely use their attractiveness to gain advantage. They used the promise and withdrawal of sexual validation to reshape the very personalities of the men around them. A merchant might believe himself to be pursuing profit, but closer examination revealed that his business decisions were unconsciously oriented around maintaining the approval of women whose regard he valued. A nobleman might imagine himself driven by honor and ambition, yet his choices consistently served to demonstrate his worthiness to feminine arbiters whose judgment he feared to lose. Even men who prided themselves on their independence from such concerns revealed, through their very protestations of immunity, how thoroughly their self-conception had been shaped by the need to prove themselves acceptable to feminine evaluation. This led Machiavelli to his most disturbing conclusion, that masculine identity itself was largely a construction designed to serve feminine interests. The qualities that men believed made them powerful, physical strength, aggressive competitiveness, the accumulation of wealth and status, were precisely those that made them useful to women who understood how to channel such energies toward their own purposes. Men competed against each other for resources and position, but the ultimate prize in these competitions was always feminine approval. They had been conditioned to believe that their struggles were for their own benefit, when in reality they were performing roles in a larger drama scripted by feminine intelligence. The recognition of this dynamic created what Machiavelli would later describe as the fundamental crisis of masculine existence. To remain unconscious of feminine manipulation was to live as a puppet, one's actions determined by strings pulled by invisible hands, but to become conscious of the manipulation without developing the strength to resist it was to experience a form of psychological torment that could drive men to madness or self-destruction. Only by achieving complete mastery over one's own weaknesses could a man hope to engage with feminine power as an equal rather than as a victim. This realization marked the beginning of what he would call the path of self-destruction, not the literal annihilation of the self, but the systematic dismantling of all those aspects of personality that made one vulnerable to external control. The weak self that sought validation, that feared rejection, that required the approval of others to maintain its sense of worth. This false construction had to be eliminated entirely before genuine strength could emerge. The process was more demanding than any military campaign or political struggle he had previously endured. It required constant vigilance against the tendency to slip back into patterns of thought and behavior that had been established over decades. Every social interaction became a test of his capacity to maintain independence from the subtle pressures that women unconsciously exerted. He had to learn to distinguish between his authentic desires and those that had been implanted by feminine influence, to separate his genuine goals from those he had adopted in order to appear worthy of approval. Most challenging of all was the recognition that resistance alone was insufficient. A man who simply opposed feminine influence remained as much under its control as one who submitted to it, merely expressing his subjugation through rebellion rather than compliance. True freedom required the development of a form of strength that was entirely self-contained, that neither sought feminine validation nor defined itself in opposition to feminine power. It demanded the cultivation of a masculine identity that was complete in itself, requiring no external confirmation of its value or legitimacy. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. As Machiavelli systematically eliminated his dependency on external approval, he found that his capacity for clear thinking increased dramatically. Political situations that had previously seemed complex revealed their underlying simplicities. Human motivations that had appeared mysterious became transparently obvious. Most importantly, his ability to predict and influence the behavior of others expanded beyond anything he had previously imagined possible. Women who had once been able to manipulate his emotions and decisions through subtle psychological pressure found their techniques ineffective against his newfound immunity, not because he had become hostile or resistant to feminine influence, but because he no longer possessed the emotional vulnerabilities through which such influence operated. He could appreciate feminine beauty without being controlled by desire for it, could enjoy feminine companionship without needing it for validation, could engage in romantic relationships without surrendering his capacity for independent judgment. This state of psychological independence proved to have practical advantages that extended far beyond personal relationships. In political negotiations, his freedom from the need to appear impressive or to gain approval allowed him to focus entirely on strategic objectives. He could make decisions based purely on rational calculation, rather than on emotional factors that might compromise his effectiveness. His opponents, still operating under the influence of various forms of psychological dependency, found themselves at a severe disadvantage when confronting someone who had achieved genuine autonomy. The second phase of Machiavelli's investigation began when he realized that his own transformation, while personally liberating, represented only the beginning of a deeper understanding. If feminine power operated through the exploitation of masculine weaknesses, then a comprehensive analysis would require him to map those weaknesses in systematic detail. He would need to understand not only how women identified and manipulated masculine vulnerabilities, but why such vulnerabilities existed in the first place and how they could be eliminated on a broader scale. His research led him into the darkest territories of human psychology, areas that conventional morality preferred to leave unexplored. He studied the ways in which mothers shaped the psychological development of their sons, implanting patterns of dependency and need that would influence their relationships with women for the remainder of their lives. He analyzed the social rituals through which young men were taught to compete for feminine attention, creating hierarchies of value that placed women in positions of ultimate judgment over masculine worth. Most disturbing was his discovery that these patterns were not accidental or natural developments, but represented a sophisticated system of psychological conditioning that had evolved over centuries. Each generation of women passed on to the next an intuitive understanding of how to maintain control over masculine behavior, while each generation of men remained largely unconscious of the forces shaping their development. The result was a form of invisible slavery that was all the more effective for being unrecognized by its victims. The techniques employed were subtle but devastatingly effective. From earliest childhood, boys learned that their most powerful source of emotional satisfaction came from gaining the approval of women. Mothers, teachers, and later romantic partners all served as dispensers of validation that became psychologically addictive. The withdrawal of such approval created anxiety and self-doubt that could be relieved only through behaviors designed to restore feminine favor. Over time, this conditioning created men who believed themselves to be independent actors while actually functioning as extensions of feminine will. The sexual component of this conditioning proved particularly sophisticated. Rather than using sexuality as a simple reward and punishment system, women had learned to create a complex economy of desire in which men competed not merely for sexual access but for the psychological satisfaction of being chosen. The promise of sexual fulfillment became secondary to the ego gratification of being deemed worthy of such fulfillment. Men would endure extraordinary hardships and make enormous sacrifices, not primarily to obtain sex, but to prove themselves deserving of feminine sexual attention. This insight revealed why conventional approaches to understanding gender dynamics failed so completely. Analysts who focused on the economic or social aspects of male-female relationships missed the fundamental psychological dimension that actually determined behavior. Women controlled men not through superior resources or institutional power, but through their ability to determine masculine self-worth. They had created a system in which men evaluated their own success primarily through feminine eyes, making them willing participants in their own subordination. The implications extended far beyond individual relationships to encompass the entire structure of civilization. Wars were fought not merely for territory or resources, but ultimately to demonstrate masculine worthiness to feminine evaluation. Economic systems were organized around the accumulation of wealth that would make men attractive to women. Even intellectual and artistic achievements were shaped by the desire to impress feminine judgment. Civilization itself could be understood as an elaborate display behavior designed to win feminine approval, with all its genuine accomplishments serving as secondary effects of this primary motivation. Recognizing this pattern, Machiavelli understood why his own transformation had been so difficult and why it remained so rare. Men who achieved independence from feminine psychological control found themselves operating outside the motivational systems that drove most human activity. They had to develop entirely new sources of purpose and satisfaction to replace those that had been eliminated through the destruction of their dependent selves. This required not only tremendous psychological strength, but the courage to face the possibility that life might be fundamentally meaningless outside the validation structures that most people took for granted. Yet the rewards of such independence were proportional to its difficulty. A man who had successfully destroyed his weak self found himself in possession of capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to those still operating under conventional psychological constraints. He could perceive the hidden motivations behind human behavior with remarkable clarity, predict responses to various stimuli with scientific precision, and influence outcomes through interventions that appeared effortless to outside observers. More importantly, he discovered that true strength was not the absence of all desire or emotion, but the capacity to experience such feelings without being controlled by them. He could appreciate feminine beauty more fully than before because his appreciation was no longer contaminated by neediness or insecurity. He could engage in passionate relationships while maintaining his essential independence, could love without losing himself, could desire without becoming enslaved by his desires. This realization marked the transition to the third phase of his understanding, in which the dynamics of power between men and women could be engaged as equals rather than as unconscious participants in a predetermined script. Women who encountered a man who had achieved genuine psychological independence often found the experience profoundly disorienting. Their usual techniques for gaining influence proved ineffective, not because they were being resisted, but because the psychological hooks upon which those techniques depended simply no longer existed. The response was typically one of increased respect coupled with wariness. Women intuitively recognized that they were dealing with a different category of masculine consciousness, one that could not be managed through conventional means. Some attempted to develop new strategies for gaining influence, while others simply acknowledged the equality and engaged on more honest terms. A few responded with hostility, as if the mere existence of such independence represented a threat to the entire system through which they had learned to navigate the world. These interactions revealed the final layer of Machiavelli's insights into feminine psychology. Women's desire for control over masculine behavior was not primarily driven by malice or conscious manipulative intent, but by a deep-seated insecurity about their own safety and value in a world where physical strength and institutional power remained largely in masculine hands. Their psychological control systems had evolved as survival mechanisms, ways of ensuring protection and resources in environments where direct confrontation would be disadvantageous. Understanding this dynamic allowed him to develop a more nuanced appreciation of feminine motivation. Women who seemed manipulative from the perspective of masculine psychology were often simply employing the most effective tools available to them for achieving security and influence. Their methods appeared devious only to those who failed to understand the constraints under which they operated. Once those constraints were recognized, feminine behavior became as rational and predictable as any other form of strategic action. This insight transformed his entire approach to relationships with women. Instead of viewing them as either objects of desire or sources of threat, he could appreciate them as fellow strategists operating within different sets of constraints and opportunities. He could admire their sophistication and effectiveness while maintaining his own independence, could learn from their techniques while remaining immune to their psychological effects. The practical applications of this understanding proved remarkable. In diplomatic negotiations involving women of power, he could anticipate their strategies and respond with appropriate countermeasures. In social situations, he could navigate complex feminine hierarchies without being drawn into their emotional dynamics. Most importantly, he could form genuine partnerships with women based on mutual respect for each other's capabilities rather than on the traditional patterns of dominance and submission that characterized most relationships. The transformation had been complete, but it had also revealed the profound loneliness that accompanies true independence. Most people, both men and women, remained trapped within the psychological systems that he had learned to transcend. They could not understand his perspective or relate to his experience, leaving him intellectually isolated even in the midst of social interaction. He had gained the capacity to see clearly, but that clarity came at the cost of easy communion with others who remained blind. Yet this isolation was itself a form of strength. It eliminated the last vestiges of dependency on external validation, forcing him to develop internal sources of satisfaction and meaning. He learned to find fulfillment in the pure exercise of understanding, in the aesthetic appreciation of human complexity, in the satisfaction of strategic effectiveness achieved through his own capabilities rather than through the cooperation or approval of others. This final stage of development revealed why so few men achieved genuine independence from feminine psychological control. The path required not only the courage to destroy one's false self, but the strength to endure the isolation that accompanied authentic selfhood. Most men preferred the comfortable slavery of unconscious dependency to the harsh freedom of complete self-reliance. They would rather remain manipulatable than face the responsibility of determining their own purposes and values without external guidance. But for those few who completed the journey, the rewards were extraordinary. They achieved a form of personal sovereignty that made them truly unconquerable by external forces. Having destroyed everything within themselves that could be used as a point of leverage by others, they became immune to all forms of psychological manipulation. They could engage with the world from a position of pure strength, taking what they wanted and discarding what they didn't need, without reference to the opinions or desires of others. This was the ultimate meaning of Machiavelli's observation, that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. It was not merely a statement about psychological resilience, but a description of the only path to genuine human freedom. In a world where most people remained unconscious slaves to various forms of external control, true power belonged to those few individuals who had achieved complete self-mastery. The implications for society were profound and disturbing. If Machiavelli's analysis was correct, then most social institutions and cultural practices served primarily to maintain systems of psychological control rather than to promote genuine human flourishing. Education, religion, entertainment, and even philosophy functioned as elaborate mechanisms for keeping people dependent on external validation, and therefore manageable by those who understood how to manipulate such dependencies. The few individuals who achieved genuine independence found themselves operating as a separate species within human society, capable of perceiving and manipulating social forces that remained invisible to others. They could predict mass behavior with scientific accuracy, influence cultural trends through strategic interventions, and shape the development of institutions through their understanding of the psychological factors that actually determined human action. This created an ethical dilemma that Machiavelli never fully resolved. Should such knowledge be shared more widely, potentially liberating others from unconscious slavery, but also disrupting the social stability that such slavery maintained? Or should it remain the exclusive possession of those few individuals strong enough to achieve and handle genuine independence, leaving the majority in their comfortable illusions while ensuring that the most capable minds retained the ability to guide social development from behind the scenes? The question became more pressing as he realized that his insights into feminine psychology were only one component of a much larger understanding of human manipulation and control. The same principles that revealed how women managed masculine behavior could be applied to analyze how political leaders controlled populations, how religious institutions managed believers, how economic systems shaped consumer behavior, and how cultural narratives influenced individual self-conception. In each case, the pattern was similar. A relatively small number of individuals who understood the psychological mechanisms of control exercised influence over much larger numbers who remained unconscious of the forces shaping their behavior. The consciously manipulative represented only a small fraction of the controlling group. Most exercised influence through intuitive understanding of psychological principles rather than through deliberate strategic planning. This realization led to Machiavelli's final and most disturbing insight, that human civilization might be understood as a vast pyramid of unconscious slavery, with each level exercising control over those below, while remaining controlled by those above. Women controlled men through psychological manipulation, but were themselves controlled by social conventions and biological imperatives they had not chosen. Political leaders controlled populations, but were themselves controlled by the structural requirements of maintaining power. Even those at the apparent top of various hierarchies were ultimately constrained by forces beyond their understanding or control. True freedom, therefore, could be achieved only by individuals who managed to step outside these systems of control entirely. Such individuals would necessarily be rare, since the process of achieving genuine independence was so difficult, and the isolation that accompanied it was so complete. But their rarity was also their power. In a world of unconscious slaves, the few who achieved genuine freedom became capable of extraordinary influence and effectiveness. The practical implications of this understanding would occupy Machiavelli for the remainder of his life. Having achieved personal independence from feminine psychological control, he could begin to explore what it meant to operate as a truly free agent within the broader systems of social manipulation and control. He could study these systems from the outside, understanding their mechanics without being subject to their influence, and potentially develop methods for helping others achieve similar liberation. But such work would require extreme caution. The existing systems of control, while oppressive to individual freedom, also maintained social stability and prevented the chaos that might result from widespread psychological liberation. Any attempt to share his insights would need to account for the possibility that most people were not prepared for the responsibilities that accompanied genuine independence. and that premature liberation might result in social breakdown rather than human flourishing. The document that emerged from these considerations would necessarily be limited in scope and coded in language that would be comprehensible only to those already capable of undertaking the journey towards psychological independence. It would describe the problem and hint at solutions, but would not provide a complete manual for liberation. Such information was too dangerous to be widely disseminated and could be safely transmitted only to individuals who had already demonstrated the strength and wisdom necessary to handle it responsibly. Thus, the final form of his insights into feminine psychology and masculine liberation remained intentionally incomplete, a map that would guide serious seekers while protecting society from the chaos that might result from mass psychological awakening. It was a document designed for the few rather than the many, acknowledging that true wisdom must always be restricted to those capable of bearing its weight without being crushed by its implications. The man who destroys his weak self achieves a form of invulnerability that extends far beyond immunity to feminine manipulation. He becomes unconquerable by any external force because he no longer possesses the internal weaknesses through which such forces operate. This is the ultimate goal of human development, the point at which an individual becomes truly sovereign over his own existence. Yet it is also the most dangerous knowledge that can be possessed, requiring absolute discretion in its application and transmission. In the end, Machiavelli's investigation into the nature of feminine psychology had led him to discoveries that transcended the original scope of his inquiry. He had uncovered not merely the mechanics of gender-based control systems, but the fundamental principles that governed all forms of human manipulation and liberation. The woman who had first drawn his attention in the Medici Palace had unknowingly initiated a journey that would culminate in insights capable of transforming human consciousness itself. But with such understanding came the recognition that transformation, while possible, must remain the exception rather than the rule. Society required its unconscious slaves just as much as it needed its conscious masters. The balance between control and freedom, manipulation and liberation, could be maintained only through the careful preservation of ignorance among the many, and the gradual cultivation of wisdom among the few. This was the final paradox of human existence. That complete freedom could be achieved only by accepting the necessity of widespread slavery, and that true strength could be demonstrated only through the restraint required to prevent the destruction of the systems that such strength had learned to transcend. The man who destroys his weak self gains the power to destroy everything else as well, but achieves true mastery only when he chooses not to exercise that power. The document ended where it began, with the recognition that knowledge of human nature's deepest truths carried responsibilities that few were prepared to accept. Those who sought such knowledge for personal advantage would find themselves disappointed. It could not be used effectively by anyone still motivated by the ego needs it was designed to eliminate. Only those who had already achieved the internal transformation it described would be capable of applying its insights without being corrupted by them. Such individuals would recognize themselves in these pages not through intellectual comprehension alone, but through the resonance of lived experience. They would understand that the journey toward genuine independence was one that each person must undertake alone, guided by principles that could be described but never fully explained. The weak self that must be destroyed was unique to each individual, as were the specific techniques required for its elimination. Yet the general principles remained constant across all variations. The path to invulnerability lay through the systematic elimination of psychological dependencies, the cultivation of complete self-reliance, and the development of internal sources of satisfaction that required no external validation. These were the foundations upon which true strength was built, the bedrock upon which a man could stand while watching the storms of human manipulation rage harmlessly around him. In achieving such strength, he would discover that the darkest wants he had attributed to women were merely reflections of his own shadow, projections of his unacknowledged dependencies and fears. The enemy had never been feminine psychology, but his own weakness in the face of it. By destroying that weakness, he eliminated not only his vulnerability to manipulation, but his need to understand others as threats to his autonomy. This was the final liberation, the recognition that strength, once achieved, transformed all relationships from contests of power into opportunities for genuine connection. The man who could not be destroyed by others could finally afford to love them without reservation, knowing that no external force could compromise his essential sovereignty. In losing everything that had once defined him, He had gained everything that truly mattered. The pale light of dawn was breaking through the windows of his study as Machiavelli set down his pen, the work complete. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of Florence were calling the faithful to morning prayers, summoning them to rituals of submission that they would mistake for worship. But for those few who possessed the eyes to see, a different kind of salvation had been offered, one that required no external savior, demanded no submission to higher authority, and promised no reward beyond the fierce joy of absolute freedom. The document would find its way to those for whom it was intended, as such knowledge always did. They would recognize it not as theory to be debated, but as a description of transformations they had already begun to experience. For them, it would serve as confirmation and guidance, a map of territories they were already exploring, through their own courageous journey into the unknown country of genuine human independence. As for the rest, they would continue in their comfortable chains, their unconscious servitude, their pleasant dreams of significance and connection. They would remain safely protected from truths too harsh for their current level of development, free to evolve at their own pace toward whatever destination their individual courage and wisdom might eventually allow them to reach. The sun rose higher, illuminating the manuscript that lay upon the desk like a weapon too powerful for most hands to wield. In the streets below, the great comedy of human unconsciousness continued its eternal performance, while in the silence of his chamber, one man had achieved the only victory that ultimately mattered: complete and permanent conquest of himself. Thus concludes this examination of the deepest principles governing human nature and the path to genuine liberation from all forms of external control. May it serve those few who possess the strength to undertake the journey it describes, and may it remain safely incomprehensible to those not yet prepared for its implications.